Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, I noticed there's some glitches because it's not meant to look like that, but I used some special characters and it's now showing like that. Let me see if I can. Yeah, okay, that's all right. So my name is Joana Chicau, and I'm a researcher in data ethics. I'm a lecturer on computational arts and design. Um, I think the glitchy part you're seeing is that I'm saying that I'm also a dancer, and somehow that got codified into something else. But I have a background in dance and choreography, and that's what I would like to bring to the discussion today. I'm currently affiliated with the Creative Computing Institute at the University of the Arts London. I'm a PhD candidate there and also a lecturer. So in my work, I have incorporated choreography and embodied methods to engage in critical understanding of technology through the creation of performances, digital artworks, and workshops. So today what I'll do is that I'll present some of these works and they center the body in these experiences and in the investigation of data-driven and AI algorithms. And also an important aspect of it is that it involves people and also myself as a maker of these works in reflecting on the impact of these technologies on society and ourselves. Also, I want to emphasize the fact that bodies here is in plural. This is a reference to scholar Kata Spill, who highlights the need to diversify and expand on the notion of bodies, which in human-computer interaction, also computer sciences, is often presented as a very normative and idealized type of body. So the first work that I'll present has been quite long-term collaboration with Jonathan Chemroos, a artist, musician, also researcher based in the Netherlands. And we have this work called Anatomies of Intelligence. And as part of this project, we've produced workshops, performances, tools. So I tend to sort of create multiple, sort of from each project, sort of multiple artifacts or formats, let's say. And the image that you see on the screen is from one of our performances. And you can see that there's a projection on the floor, and there's people surrounding it. In the image, there's me holding a microphone. There's a narrative that is being presented to the audience, but the audience is also very close to me. So you can see the other people around are actually audience members. So this performance was built precisely to give this idea of an immersive experience. And what we're actually doing is that we're live coding, which means that we run algorithms in real time in front of an audience. And in this case, we are executing a k-means algorithm. So we have built our little data set. And what a k-means algorithm does is that it looks at similarities and proximities between different data points within this data set. And you can visualize that in different ways. Like you can try and flatten the dimensions. This might get a little bit too technical, but you can flatten the dimensions of these different data points and try to visualize it in a 2D or 3D environment, which is what we try to do. But more important than doing anything extremely accurate is actually to embrace some aspects of subjectivity in this process. So we are the ones labeling the data set and trying to understand the data set that we're gathering, and the data set itself is about anatomy, and mostly anatomy from, well, there's some different historical artifacts, but we're interested in the turn in anatomy where a lot of the collections were being made around the Enlightenment. There's also a lot of ties with colonialism and collections of these artifacts. And there's also something quite important being done at the time, which is people would perform this is getting a little bit too graphic, but they would perform dissections with bodies also in front of an audience. So there's this idea of exploring science, but also as spectacle in front of other researchers and people from also science, the science field at the time. So we wanted to connect that spatial and performative space of anatomy that it's no longer, well, there are still theaters, operation theaters, but not quite working the same way as historically. But we wanted to sort of draw inspiration from that, engage the audience, but what we are actually dissecting is an algorithm. What we're actually trying to reveal in front of an audience are different steps of this K-means algorithm. And it's also sonified. I'm not going to go into details around showing video and audio for these because it doesn't quite work with Zoom, so I'll paste the links later. And this is a quote from a curator that hosted our work a few years ago. And I quite like how she puts it. The curators are always great at putting things into words. So Hara Hossa says, what are the crossing points between the captures and inscribed elements of the so-called bodies through the ever-damaging participation of modern anatomical technosciences? How does the holistic divide between health and pathology provoke technical wounds across fragile, somewhat political, mediated encounters? What are the explicit sacrifice areas that datasets and computational learning models render on a daily basis? Why do categories, algorithms, and prediction processes constitute bodily harm? And how could they constitute situated healing and partial reparations instead? So I really like how she, again, draws this line from our historical references to the day-to-day computational practices. And to bring an image of what I mean by this historical research that we've done, one of the images that we were quite curious about is this Leiden Anatomical Theater. And we actually went to a reproduction of these in Leiden because I used to live in the Netherlands and this project started there. And you can see that we tried in some ways to sort of have some elements of these spaces represented during the performance, not again so graphic, but in the sense of the circularity of the space, the fact that the audience would be around it, and we try to reproduce at least this oval circular space as well. And then we also project in these like multiple layers of thread of textiles, semi-transparent, which also allures to some of the medical textiles that are used, etc. So there's definitely some ambience that we create, and this is also in our digital environment. So the K-means algorithm and our data set, they both live in a website that we've built. And what you can see in the screen now is this environment that is a 3D simulation of a space, and you can see the data set spread out into this space. And then there's also some words, which these are some of the words that we use to some of the taxonomy, some of the text that we use to provide categories to our data set. And this is then used by the K-means clustering algorithm to find similarities across the data set. So we make all of these, as I said, it's a very subjective process, but we make it also explicit to an audience. We don't try to make it overly or in any way like scientific. We want precisely to cause to have the audience question and be curious about what it is that we are doing. And so the performance goes through different steps. We start by showing the audience some of the dataset items separately, and then only after a while we execute the algorithm, and then it goes quite slowly. It's a very quick process because we don't have a huge data set, but we slow it down so that people can see the different commands and the measures that the algorithm is trying to do across different data points. And it's a quite slow process. It's zonified. And you're going to see that people do tend to relax a lot in this space, even though it feels some of the images feel oddly, um, explicit in some ways, and it's all a little bit strange, but people somehow get used to this space and they really get immersed in it. So this is the image that I mentioned. Some people, because it takes time, some people tend to just relax and then come closer to the screens, get away, focus on listening to the process. There's also some printouts that we give to people that they can read through with some of these categories that we assembled from the categorization of the data set. There's like different steps that we build up throughout the performance. And we also built these, it looks like membranes, but it's actually some kind of pillows. Yeah. So the whole thing is somewhat odd, and people do tend to yet people do tend to stay curious and enjoy this immersiveness. And while we were, for the most part, trying to focus on the physical performance or an in-person performance, we did have the COVID-19 in between. So we also devised a fully remote performance, and people could actually join and interact with all these different dataset elements online in the space that I've showed you before. So that's also been it also people could actually also go through the whole process online. Yet it was not exactly the same thing, but we did our best to try to translate that experience to an online space. And these another, in this case, theater critic gave this small description that I thought it was quite interesting. So she described our performance as an interactive storytelling made up of ancient iconographies on the theme of anatomy and knowledge, graphically displayed by an infinite network of strings of codes and connections. So it's interesting, she again finds it curious, this connection between historical references, but also a very contemporary algorithmic process. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions about what I just said, but I'm going to move on to a few other works just to expand on what, the kind of work that I do. So Replica is a project that I've been involved, and the lead project lead is Diana Alina Serbanescu, also known as Melanti. And this one was also an interesting project in the sense that I took part in sort of long-term residencies in which we, as you can see in the image, this is Mika Satomi and Kate Ryan, but I also was part of it both as a dancer and technologist and designer. So it was really interesting to sort of have this full experience of the work. And I would use a similar wearable as as you can see in the image. These are different types of sensors. They can do things like monitor heart rate. They would also monitor the position of arms or legs, bending, etc. All sorts of sort of movement and body data. And what was really interesting about it is that over time, we wanted to imagine different rituals. What could it mean to exist with these artifacts, constantly carrying these wearable technologies? And we did that through a series of performances and physical training to imagine what it could look like to live with this. And we even, in one of the situations, in one of the residencies, we even went outside. So we had to also devise these technologies in ways that was not dependent fully on Wi-Fi. Things that we don't oftentimes think about, but they had to be somewhat independent, and they had to store data also independently. And it was a really interesting process. It felt very real. It felt almost like as being like in this live action role play sort of situation, because we had to live with these things, not overnight, but during the day while doing physical training. We were mostly following Grotowski, which is a type of physical training that also required some voice work, which was really interesting as well. There were also microphones connected to that, which we would turn off at certain times. And we would see this sort of continuous monitoring, and the project further evolved to more performances and visualizations of the data as well. And finally, the work that I'm doing now, human-computer counter choreographies, is here's an image, is a performance, but it's also a series of workshops. And I've done a small study with a small group of people. And essentially, what I'm trying to understand with a bit more of a sort of academic frame is whether choreography can help people critique and reflect upon data tracking technologies. In this case, I'm mostly looking at online tracking. So what happens when people access apps and digital services, things that they access every day, and could choreography help them in raising awareness of the impact that it might have within their lives, and raise discussions around what it does, and do that through, again, a choreographic and embodied approach. This is a performance in which I am browsing through the internet, but I use choreography as almost making a parallel between what it means to move across different web environments and the traces we leave behind, which are the data. And I involve the audience. They also have to move during this performance, and I try to use it as a way to explain different aspects around tracking, like user profiling, fingerprinting, etc. So for these, I use scripts that I have developed for these. And there's also, I also repurposed and redesigned a DuckDuckGo privacy extension, the DuckDuckGo privacy extension, which already exists, and it's part of it's a product of a company, but they put it open source, which is great, and that means that I can use it for other purposes, such as a performance, which they weren't imagining it would happen. But I actually, yeah, I've been in touch with them, and I think it's an interesting sort of discussion to have, like how these things like a web extension can be used in a more performative way with more visualizations attached to it, and also in this case a sound feedback as well. So here is an example of messages that I send throughout the performance to the audience. So this is the end of a section where I thank them for performing movements for me during the performance. And it's been really an interesting project and process. I have learned that people find it, again, like strange. There's always an element of strangeness in the work that I do, but it seems to be impactful, and people do see the connections, which I wasn't expecting. I thought it was just me thinking about choreography and data tracking, but people do find it an interesting and actually in many ways fresh way of thinking about these problematics, because I think a lot, especially in Europe, there's a lot of discussions about data protection, and people are a bit tired of the topic. AI isn't helping with a lot of hype discussions, but not necessarily clarifying the issues around it. And I think people having novel approaches and having ways of engaging people that situate the body also in the equation seems to be useful. So these are things that people had told me, is that the performance situates the body within the technology, our actions online leave traces as in life, and that the performance really felt like it was making underlying web processes more exposed and explainable to an audience. So I will end with that, and hopefully I sprinkled some ideas of why I think bodies are important in relating to technologies and understanding how we feel about them, about the technologies we have around them, being data tracking, and that's one of my focus, but that's just one of the first instances to then use AI technologies on top of that. So I'll finish with that.